They called it the deadliest weapon beneath the waves. But when American submarines fired their first torpedoes in World War II, nothing happened. Explosions never came. Targets escaped. And in the silent depths of the Pacific, disbelief turned to rage. Commanders risked everything, stalking Japanese warships for hours, only to watch their torpedoes hit and bounce off like toys. Men were dying, missions were failing, and no one in Washington believed them. For 2 years, the U.S. Navy's most powerful submarines fought with weapons that simply didn't work, and the truth was buried under arrogance and denial. This is not just a story about broken machines. It's about broken trust, ignored warnings, and how pride almost cost America the Pacific War. Because sometimes, the enemy isn't out there, it's the lie we refuse to see. In the early days of World War II, the U.S. Navy entered the Pacific confident, determined, and armed with what they believed were the finest weapons in the world. Their submarines, sleek, deadly, and silent, were meant to choke Japan's lifelines, to strike from the shadows and turn the tide of war beneath the waves. But soon, that confidence began to crack. Torpedoes struck enemy ships, yet failed to explode. Others ran too deep, missing their targets entirely. Some even circled back, threatening the very submarines that launched them. What should have been America's greatest undersea weapon became its most humiliating failure. For 2 long years, commanders sent desperate reports, begging for answers. Yet bureaucrats on land dismissed them, blaming poor aim rather than faulty design. While sailors risked their lives in silence, the truth sank deeper, hidden beneath layers of pride, denial, and deadly mistakes. This is the story of how arrogance nearly doomed a fleet, and how a handful of men finally fought back to expose the truth. When war erupted in the Pacific, America's submariners believed they were holding the most advanced weapon of the seas, the Mark 14 torpedo. Sleek, expensive, and packed with cutting-edge technology, it was the pride of the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ordnance. Decades of research had gone into it. It promised perfection, the ultimate hunter's spear to cripple Japan's mighty fleet. The submarines themselves were masterpieces of engineering. Beneath their steel hulls lived young men trained for silence and precision, men who carried the burden of invisible warfare. They would strike from the depths, unseen, destroy enemy convoys, and vanish before the enemy could react. The plan was flawless, on paper. But war doesn't honor blueprints. The first combat patrols in late 1941 and early 1942 should have been triumphs. Japanese shipping lines stretched thin across the Pacific, ripe targets for submarine ambush. Commanders lined up their shots, released their torpedoes, and watched in disbelief as explosions never came. Some missed entirely. Others hit their targets squarely, only to thud harmlessly against enemy hulls, leaving their crews stunned and exposed. At first, these failures were dismissed as bad luck. The ocean, after all, was unpredictable. But as patrol after patrol returned with similar stories, disbelief began turning into something darker, dread. Captain after captain filed detailed reports. They documented duds, premature explosions, and torpedoes that ran far deeper than set. But the Bureau of Ordnance, the very institution responsible for designing and testing these weapons, refused to believe them. The torpedo is perfect, they insisted. The fault, they claimed, lay with the men, not the machine. For submarine crews, those words were a death sentence. Imagine being trapped in the darkness of a submarine, 200 feet below the surface, enemy destroyers hunting above, depth charges echoing through the hull, and knowing your only weapon doesn't work. The silence after a failed shot was worse than the explosions that followed. It was the sound of helplessness. Of faith cracking under pressure. Yet these men continued to fight, clinging to hope that the next torpedo, maybe the next, would finally do its job. Every mission became a gamble not just against the Japanese Navy, but against their own government's denial. What began as a technical malfunction was slowly transforming into something far more dangerous, a crisis of trust. And it was only the beginning. By 1942, the Pacific had become a graveyard of American opportunity. Submarines prowled for weeks through enemy waters, stalking convoys, waiting for the perfect shot, only to watch it all unravel in silence. Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton of the Wahoo once described it like throwing pebbles at a battleship. His crew had done everything right, perfect approach, ideal angle, range set to precision, yet the torpedo they fired hit with a dull clang and drifted away. The Japanese ship sped off unharmed. What followed was disbelief, then fury. The Mark 14 torpedo was failing in almost every way imaginable. Some ran too deep, 10, sometimes even 15 feet below their intended depth, slipping harmlessly under the target. Others detonated too early, sensing a magnetic field that didn't exist. And when they finally did strike the hull, the contact detonator, the very device designed to trigger the explosion, collapsed on impact like a crushed soda can. Crews risked everything to get within firing distance. They would creep silently through the depths, engines off, listening only to the hum of enemy propellers above. One wrong sound, and the Japanese destroyers would rain depth charges, shaking the submarine like a tin drum. Every failed torpedo meant another life-threatening chase, another reminder that their weapons were betraying them. The frustration boiled over. Patrol logs filled with coded anger. Hit, no explosion. Premature detonation. 3 fish fired, all duds. The words repeated across hundreds of missions. These weren't isolated mistakes, this was a pattern of failure stretching across the Pacific. But back in Pearl Harbor, and worse, in Washington, the Bureau of Ordnance refused to face the truth. To admit fault would be to question years of testing, funding, and pride. Officers in crisp uniforms dismissed reports from the front as operator error. Some even accused submarine captains of exaggerating to cover their own incompetence. The gap between the front lines and the command offices grew into a chasm. On one side, the men who risked their lives daily, trapped in steel coffins beneath the sea. On the other, the comfortable bureaucrats who refused to believe their masterpiece was flawed. Each mission became a cruel ritual. A submarine would leave port loaded with 24 torpedoes, and return weeks later, claiming dozens of missed chances, with little to show but empty tubes and haunted eyes. Sailors joked bitterly that their torpedoes were the best the Japanese ever had, because none of them worked against the enemy. What made it worse was that every failure cost lives, not just American, but also Japanese targets that escaped to fight another day. Ships carrying supplies, fuel, and troops continued to reach their destinations because of faulty engineering and human arrogance. In one tragic instance, a submarine commander fired at a Japanese transport ship, watching 2 torpedoes hit and fail. Moments later, destroyers counterattacked, forcing the submarine to dive deep and evade for hours. When they finally surfaced, the commander wrote in his log, "We fight the enemy, and we fight our own weapons. Only one of them listens." 2 years into the war, the pattern was undeniable. America's undersea fleet, designed to cripple Japan's economy and naval power, was nearly paralyzed. The ocean was becoming a silent witness to a colossal failure, hidden behind official reports and blind pride. And as the list of lost opportunities grew longer, one question began to echo through every submarine in the Pacific. How long would the truth be ignored? By mid-1943, the truth was no longer hiding beneath the waves, it was being buried on land. Dozens of submarine commanders had reported the same thing: direct hits, no detonations. Premature explosions. Circular runs that nearly killed their own crews. And yet, the Bureau of Ordnance stood firm. The problem, they claimed, was the men, not the machine. In Washington's marble corridors, reputation mattered more than results. The Mark 14 torpedo had been designed in secret, tested under controlled conditions, and declared flawless long before the war began. To admit that it was defective would mean admitting that the Navy's most trusted engineers, and the millions of dollars behind them, had failed. Pride became policy. So, the reports were rewritten, complaints dismissed, and evidence quietly shelved. Officers who questioned the torpedoes' reliability found themselves labeled as disruptive or insubordinate. Even senior commanders were warned not to undermine morale. Behind official smiles and polished speeches, an invisible war was being fought, not against Japan, but against the truth itself. Submarine skippers at the front grew bitter. They knew the ocean didn't lie. They watched their torpedoes thud harmlessly against enemy hulls, and they knew that something was deeply, catastrophically wrong. But each message they sent home was met with the same cold response: the weapon performs according to specifications. Some began taking risks to prove otherwise. Commander Charles Swede Mommsen, a brilliant engineer and decorated officer, grew tired of excuses. During a test, he ordered torpedoes fired under controlled conditions near Hawaii. What he discovered shocked him: torpedoes were running nearly 15 feet deeper than their depth settings indicated. The pressure sensor system, it turned out, had been calibrated for testing in freshwater lakes, not the dense saltwater of the Pacific. Still, Washington refused to listen. Mommsen and others like him pushed further, conducting their own unauthorized tests, risking their careers and reputations. Slowly, piece by piece, the ugly truth surfaced. The magnetic exploder, meant to detonate beneath a ship's keel, was hypersensitive. It reacted to small magnetic fluctuations and often exploded long before reaching its target. The contact detonator was even worse, collapsing on impact when striking at sharp angles. Despite undeniable evidence, official denial persisted. The Bureau sent new memos insisting that crews were failing to understand torpedo procedures. Orders were given to stop independent testing. To question the system was to question the Navy itself, and that was unforgivable. For the men underwater, every mission now carried not only the fear of enemy fire but the weight of bureaucratic betrayal. They risked their lives to prove what their superiors already knew but refused to admit. In one letter never meant for publication, a commander wrote, "I no longer fear the Japanese. I fear our own blindness." The cover-up lasted far longer than anyone today would believe. Even as ships went down and missions failed, reports were softened before reaching command. Paper victories replaced real ones. But beneath the surface, frustration was turning into rebellion. Submarine captains, engineers, and mechanics were preparing to take matters into their own hands, to test, to prove, and finally to confront the system that had condemned them to fight with broken weapons. And soon, their defiance would ignite a confrontation that could no longer be ignored, one that would change the course of the war beneath the waves. By the summer of 1943, the silence had become unbearable. Every failed mission, every lost crew, every unanswered report had built a pressure that could no longer be contained. The men beneath the waves had reached their breaking point, and they were done being ignored. In the Pacific, one submarine commander decided to defy orders. Lieutenant Commander John Scott of the USS Tenosa was stalking a massive Japanese oil tanker, a perfect target. He fired one torpedo, direct hit, no explosion. A second, same result. Then a third, a fourth, a fifth, all struck cleanly, all failed to detonate. The tanker drifted away, battered but alive. Scott, furious, surfaced his submarine, recovered one of the dud torpedoes, and hauled it back to Pearl Harbor as evidence. When he arrived, he demanded an inspection, not from the Bureau, but in front of witnesses. What they found confirmed the worst fears of every submariner in the fleet. The contact detonator mechanism, the very heart of the Mark 14, was so fragile it collapsed under its own shock. It wasn't war-tested, it was lab-tested. That single act of defiance, bringing the dud back home, finally forced the Navy to listen. Engineers were ordered to investigate, and within weeks, more field tests followed. For the first time, instead of simulated experiments in controlled lakes, torpedoes were tested in real ocean combat conditions. What they discovered was a trifecta of disaster. 1. Depth control system. Calibrated for freshwater, it made torpedoes run up to 15 feet too deep. 2. Magnetic exploder, so unstable it often triggered early or not at all. 3. Contact detonator, structurally weak, failing at direct hits when striking at sharp angles. Years of arrogance and blind confidence had created the perfect storm of failure. A weapon designed to destroy the enemy had instead betrayed its own creators. When the truth finally reached Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of the Pacific Submarine Fleet, his reaction was explosive. Furious at the Bureau's denial, he ordered his own tests, bypassing Washington entirely. Lockwood declared, "If the Bureau won't believe us, we'll make them." Under his orders, the submariners dismantled the sacred Mark 14 and rebuilt it piece by piece. They removed the magnetic exploder entirely and redesigned the contact detonator for strength rather than sensitivity. Field tests proved it beyond doubt, the torpedo finally worked. For the first time since the war began, American submarines could truly fight back. In late 1943, the ocean began to change. Japanese supply lines started to bleed. Convoys vanished, tankers burned, and warships disappeared beneath the waves. Within months, the U.S. submarine fleet, once crippled by failure, became Japan's greatest nightmare. The victory wasn't just mechanical. It was moral. It belonged to the commanders who defied silence, to the engineers who risked careers for truth, and to the crews who refused to give up even when betrayed by their own weapons. The Bureau of Ordnance eventually issued quiet corrections, rewriting history in footnotes and technical memos. But for those who fought with broken torpedoes, no apology could undo the years of frustration and loss. They had turned failure into fury, and fury into victory. And in doing so, they didn't just fix a weapon. They restored faith, in courage, in truth, and in the men who dared to speak it. When the Mark 14 finally worked, it was as if the ocean itself had changed sides. Suddenly, the same submarines that had spent years firing useless torpedoes became the most lethal hunters in the Pacific. What had once been missions of frustration turned into symphonies of precision and vengeance. Within months, Japanese shipping began to vanish from naval charts. Tankers carrying vital fuel were sunk in the middle of the night. Supply convoys burned along the horizon. American submarines, now armed with reliable weapons, strangled Japan's economy, cutting off food, oil, and raw materials. It was a quiet war, fought in darkness and silence, but its results were thunderous. By 1945, U.S. submarines had destroyed more than half of Japan's merchant fleet and crippled its ability to sustain war. And yet, the victory was bittersweet. For every triumph, there lingered the memory of what could have been, the hundreds of ships that escaped in 1942 and 1943 because pride had been placed above truth. The torpedo scandal became a silent lesson etched into the Navy's history. Engineers learned that technology means nothing without humility, and commanders learned that courage isn't only measured in battle, sometimes it's measured in the willingness to question authority. In the end, the story of America's torpedo failure wasn't just about machinery. It was about men who refused to accept lies, who risked their careers and their lives for the truth. They proved that wars aren't only won with steel and firepower, but with integrity. Because arrogance can sink a fleet long before the enemy ever does. And as the Pacific War drew to its close, one truth remained: the torpedo crisis had nearly lost the war, but the men who fought to fix it had reminded the world of something far greater. That even in war, honesty is a weapon. War reveals truth in the harshest ways. It exposes not only the flaws in our weapons, but the cracks in our pride. For 2 long years, America's submariners fought an invisible battle, not just against the enemy above, but against the blindness within their own command. The story of the Mark 14 torpedo is not just a technical failure, it is a mirror held up to human nature. It shows how arrogance can silence reason, how denial can cost lives, and how truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always find its way to the surface. The ocean does not lie. Every dud that sank into its depths carried the weight of a warning, that victory built on pride is only an illusion. It took courage, not in combat, but in conscience, to face that truth. When the torpedoes finally worked, it wasn't just a mechanical triumph, it was a moral one. The men who refused to stay silent proved that real strength lies not in obedience, but in conviction. In the end, America did not lose the Pacific, but it came close, not because of its enemies, but because of its own certainty. And that may be the greatest lesson of all. That in war, as in life, the deadliest weapon is not the one that fails to explode. It's the truth we refuse to hear.